Um, my name is Jason Bordoff with the White House Council on Environmental Quality and the National Economic Council. I want to thank you all for joining us for this morning's White House Grid Modernization event. Modernizing our nation's electric infrastructure, encouraging innovation in the electric grid, promoting a clean energy economy, these are all key priorities for the administration. And that's why we're so excited to have you with us here today for a dialogue about how we can address the challenges that face our electric infrastructure going forward and what steps the administration has taken and will be taking to help us achieve that goal. And before I turn the program over to the President's Distinguished Science Advisor, I just want to take a moment to thank just a few of the people, I apologize, I probably won't capture them all, who really helped make today's event possible, as well as the policy framework that is being released today. I in particular want to acknowledge my White House colleagues, Phil Weiser and Anish Chopra, who worked with me to spearhead this effort here in the White House. George Arnold of NIST and Pat Hoffman of the Department of Energy, who chair the Smart Grid Subcommittee of the National Science and Technology Council, and then the dedicated and indefatigable and incredibly talented staff who've done such extraordinary work to help pull this all together, particularly Daniel Kilduff, Nick Sinai, Katrina Pielli, Rob Letzler, Doug McKeel, Michelle Dallafour, as well as many of those from a range of agencies who participated in this effort. This has really been a true team effort, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some again. I apologize for that. So again, thank you for coming, and it's my pleasure to welcome to the lectern the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Dr. John Holdren.
Well, thank you, Jason, and good morning, everybody. And let me add to Jason Bordoff's welcome, the welcome from President Obama and myself to this quite extraordinary event. Clearly, we can see we've got lights. We can hear we've got audio. I know everybody's pockets and belt holsters are stuffed with the electronic devices that we all charged overnight. So the grid is well represented here. It's functioning. But we're here today really to consider more closely how valuable and indeed how crucial the grid is. It's a creation like so many of the creations of technology that we really tend to underappreciate until we lose it. We can lose it, of course, as we did in Snowmageddon a little more than a year ago in Washington, D.C. We can lose it from a hurricane. We can lose it from a geomagnetic storm. And when we lose it, we come to understand really more graphically how important it is. But we're also here to consider how much more valuable the grid could be with the additional benefits that modernization could bring to it. Thinking just how important the grid is as a baseline, when the National Academy of Engineering convened in 2003 to rank the top engineering achievements of the 20th century, all the products of human ingenuity and engineering acumen that have transformed our lives, electrification ranked as the #1 achievement, above the computer, above the telephone, above the automobile, and every other modern convenience. Electrification, that is the grid, was the first ranked engineering achievement of the 20th century, according to the NAE. Now, a lot has changed, obviously, since the day 125 years ago when the city of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, installed a 1 kV alternating current distribution system, becoming in doing that the first city to switch over from the then state-of-the-art direct current system and thus free itself from the need to install multiple generators all across town, each tethered closely to its particular load. In those days, the headliner for a gathering like this might have been Nikola Tesla, who is smart enough that he might not have laughed if you had told him then that a $100,000 vehicle would someday bear his name. He might not also have laughed if you told him that the lower rates one might enjoy by plugging in that vehicle at night would be one of the countless good reasons why the grid he helped develop would, in the year 2011, find itself on the brink of a revolution. But that's exactly what's happening today. Not just Teslas, but also Volts and Leafs and other members of a new generation of electric vehicles are helping to inspire us to reimagine the grid. And it's not just the devices that consume electricity that are transforming our ideas about what the grid can be. New ways of generating electricity, from the largest wind turbines to the smallest rooftop panels, are demanding a new degree of flexibility and adaptability in the grid. We know it's possible to get that flexibility and adaptability and greater efficiency and reliability too by calling on the capabilities of contemporary information technology to create a more integrated, more responsive, yes, a smarter grid. That task is big, but it certainly is doable. And indeed, it's already begun. The Obama administration, in partnership with a wide array of private companies and utilities, many of which are represented in this room today, is, in fact, making it happen. A 21st century grid, one endowed with interoperable digital and communications technologies, is going to better accommodate and integrate renewable sources of electricity, and it's going to facilitate the greater use of electric vehicles and electricity storage. Smart grid technologies are also going to help utilities manage stresses on the grid, such as the peak demands that this last week's heat wave imposed, to minimize blackouts and to shorten the time that it takes to restore power when it does go out. And of course, a smarter grid means an empowered consumer, a household or small business not only with greater and more reliable access to power, but a consumer with unprecedented knowledge about his or her energy use, and a consumer able to use that knowledge to modify use patterns to enhance efficiency and shrink energy bills. As many of the players in this room appreciate, in addition, a smart grid is smart for business in other ways. It provides a fertile technical and economic environment in which a whole new ecosystem of products and services can evolve and thrive, bringing benefits to consumers while providing new high-quality jobs and helping to ensure that this nation is the leader in the clean energy economy. Now, I said we've already started, and we have. Already, the Obama administration is making historic investments in smart grid technologies, including $4.5 billion of Recovery Act investments in 140 projects across the country, matched by over $5.5 billion in private funding to modernize America's electricity infrastructure. And as you will hear soon from others in our distinguished lineup of speakers this morning, those investments are just the beginning. But it's important that we not hurtle down this path without a plan and clear priorities. And that's why I want to mention in closing an important report that is being released this morning. Created by the White House-led National Science and Technology Council, which is a cabinet-level interagency group, the report, entitled A Policy Framework for the 21st Century Grid, charts a path forward and highlights the opportunities that a modernized electric system will provide for America. Specifically, the report says we are going to enable cost-effective smart grid investments by scaling what works, working with partners to better align market incentives, and learning from the Recovery Act smart grid investment so that every dollar we spend upgrading the grid gets the maximum return for consumers. We're going to unlock the potential of innovation in the electricity sector, with a continued focus on open standards that will help create national markets and promote plug-and-play operability for devices like appliances that can use energy when it's the lowest cost and thereby help reduce peak demand. We're going to empower consumers and enable informed decision-making by giving consumers access to their own energy use information in consumer and computer-friendly formats, so they can take advantage of new tools and services to manage that use. With proper privacy safeguards and consumer protections, a smarter electricity system can benefit everyone. And we're going to secure the grid by making sure grid operators have access to actionable threat information, by supporting research and development for improved cybersecurity measures, and by working with private sector stakeholders to establish accountability for meeting cybersecurity standards. I hope that you are as excited as I am by the opportunities we now have to turn today's grid into a far more powerful, flexible, and more consumer and business-friendly tool, one that can help our nation achieve important goals in the domains of clean energy, innovation, economic growth, and resilience. To tell you a little more about the many benefits linked to where this administration is going with the grid, I'd now like to introduce my close colleague, good friend, and the White House's Environmental Steward-in-Chief, Nancy Sutley, Chair of the Council on Environmental Quality. Nancy.
Thank you, John, and good morning and welcome to the White House. And we're really excited to have you all here as we talk about some incredibly important issues in our country's transition to a clean energy economy. As John said, the President has been talking to Americans about what we need to do to win the future and compete for the jobs and industries of our age. And he's laid out a plan to out-innovate, out-educate, and out-build the rest of the world by investing in the creativity and imagination of our people to secure our nation's clean energy future. And the smart grid plays a critical role in this clean energy transformation. And the President has discussed on a number of occasions how a smart grid will modernize America's ability to generate, store, and manage energy use. And he reaffirmed this in the blueprint for a secure energy future that he released in April when he called for an expanded and modernized grid that will integrate renewable energy and improve reliability. Now, the smart grid empowers homeowners and businesses to make smarter energy choices, and that'll translate into energy savings and cost savings for businesses and consumers. And a modern grid can also help utilities avoid blackouts and reduce the demand that creates a demand for new power plants. And it'll help us reach our vision for a 21st century energy economy by bringing clean energy like wind and solar to where the demand is and accommodating electric vehicles as a greater part of our national fleet. Modernizing our grid will also create jobs in the U.S. because many of these products, technologies, and services that will help consumers reap the benefits of a smarter grid are being conceived and made right here at home. And the President has made the growth of clean energy and electric vehicles, jobs, and the economy a national priority, and a more modern grid will help bring this vision to life. The administration, as John said, has invested billions of dollars in smart grid demonstration and development, which has already attracted billions more in private sector investment. And we remain committed to building on this progress and working with states, cities, and regions to support the necessary electricity infrastructure and help design policies that smooth the transition to a clean energy economy. Now, my last job before I got here was as a deputy mayor in Los Angeles and working with the largest municipal utility in the U.S. And we understood how important new grid technologies are to help keep the lights on, to improve operational and energy efficiency, and to help consumers and small businesses better manage their energy use and save money. And I know that grid modernization goes beyond smart grid technologies. It also includes the need for new transmission to integrate renewables and to increase reliability. And different states and different regions across the country have very different transmission needs. In the administration, we're trying to address this need through a variety of measures. Most recently, we've created a 10-agency renewable energy rapid response team. This rapid response team will help to achieve the administration's goal of doubling renewable energy by 2012 by ensuring close coordination among key federal agencies on the siting and permitting of renewable energy projects and the transmission to support them. This team builds on our previous efforts to improve the process for siting transmission on federal lands. Now, these efforts are vital and important, but we know that we have to win this clean energy race together. We need your ingenuity and your leadership if we're going to modernize the grid and turn the United States into the clean energy leader in the 21st century. And we know that leaders in this area come from every corner of our country and every walk of life. And I am very pleased to tell you a little bit about a couple of students who are joining us here today from the Harker School in San Jose, California, who are already generating positive change in their community and for America's clean energy future. By using off-the-shelf smart metering technologies, these students were able to reduce their high school's energy consumption by 13% and save their school more than $20,000. And they've inspired others in their area to do the same. So it is my great pleasure, I think the best job of the day, to introduce you to these very interesting and exciting young women here who are joining us today. Please welcome Shareya Indukiri and Daniela Lapidos from the Harker School in San Jose, California.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us here.
I'm Shreya Indukuri.
And I'm Daniela Lapidos.
We are two high school seniors from the Harker School in San Jose, California.
And we're here to talk about a simple solution to two problems that will continue to affect us for the rest of our lives: climate change and education.
2 years ago, we saw a presentation by ACE, the Alliance for Climate Education, a national nonprofit educating students on climate and energy. You can check them out at www.acespace.org. We applied for a grant from ACE to reduce our school's carbon footprint, and we installed an organic garden, window insulating film, and a smart energy system.
The Smart Energy Project was our favorite and most impactful element because it gives a school superintendent the knowledge of where energy is being used by the installation of smart submetering devices on a per-building basis. The superintendent can access the information in carbon tons, kilowatts, or dollars on an informative online energy dashboard.
Knowledge truly is power, no pun intended. Within the first week of installation, the dashboard brought several anomalies to light.
For example, they found out there was excess energy use in the gym. It turns out that the air conditioning had been running all weekend and no one knew about it. So when they became aware and just flipped a switch, we were able to save our school several $1,000s on their energy bill.
The results at our school were simply phenomenal. From February 2010 to February 2011, we saw 13% savings on our energy bill and a 250% return on investment.
In fact, the problem is not ours alone. EPA statistics show that 30% of an average building's energy use is used inefficiently.
We figured our school was not the only one that could benefit from such a project. We co-founded smartpowered.org in November 2009 and since then have worked with 6 schools in the Bay Area.
Take Saratoga and Los Gatos high schools. They're very close to Harker. One student heard of our project, and she immediately contacted her superintendent and set up a meeting. And with our guidance, she convinced her school board to pass money for the Smart Meter project into the next year's school budget.
We lead passionate students through this project and let them take it above and beyond what we could have imagined. The 4 simple steps are taking an energy benchmark with the EPA's online portfolio manager, presenting to the administration, finding funding, and installing the devices.
It's a great opportunity because of its low barrier to entry. It only costs about $10,000 to $20,000 per school with an 18-month payback period. Even if you're not an environmentalist, it's pretty hard to argue with a 250% ROI.
Beyond just the numbers, it's a ripple effect of energy awareness. As the superintendent observes the dashboard to reduce energy use, student leaders can educate the student body about smart energy and inspire behavioral change on campus.
We've seen students use social media tools such as Facebook and Twitter to spread the news. Rival schools have created Facebook pages to compete with each other, just like football rivalries. One high school got over 300 likes on their Smart Meter fan page in less than 12 hours.
Needless to say, it's always better to invest money into students rather than wasted energy.
Just as Secretary Chu said a few weeks ago on NPR, we would love to see a March Madness of schools competing for energy efficiency.
Through Smart Power Ed, we aim to spark a dialogue for students who care about energy use, because contrary to popular opinion, they're definitely out there and ready to take action.
We, though, as two people, represent only a very, very small fraction of the potential of youth and students to help solve our nation's energy problems. So we want to know, how are you going to harness that potential to its fullest? How are you going to prioritize energy education and inspire students to act, just like the Alliance of Climate Education did for us?
So in your amazing, complicated lives and work, remember the power of simplicity and the willingness of young people to get involved. We're here and we are listening.
Thank you so much for listening to us today, and we're excited to learn from you at the rest of this event and hopefully answer some of these questions together.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Nancy Sutley may have had the best job today. I think I've got the worst job having to follow that. I'm Tom Vilsack, USDA Secretary, and young ladies, that was a very impressive presentation. I was thinking back to when I was a junior, almost a senior in high school. No way could I have done that. That's extraordinarily impressive. And these young ladies represent the future, but I think it is instructive as we talk about smart grid technology today to also reflect on the past. 75 years ago, this country was going through a tough economic time. And we could have walked away from economic opportunity. We could have suggested that there were many reasons why this was not the right time to make investments. But indeed, we did not shrink as a nation from the challenge. We used this as an opportunity to bring electricity to rural America. And what a difference that has made to agriculture, to small-town life, and to activities that are taking place now in the breadbasket of the United States. We find ourselves today in a similar economically challenging time. And again, we have that opportunity to make a fundamental difference for this country, and particularly in rural America. We can, instead of having to bring electricity to rural America, we now have the opportunity to create a more modern, more efficient, cleaner, and smarter system. Why is that important? Well, rural America represents 75% of the landmass of the United States, and 42 million people call rural America their home. That's one of the reasons why USDA has been heavily engaged and involved in investing in rural utilities. Last year alone, Jonathan Alstein and his group at RUS invested $7.1 billion in new infrastructure at no cost to the taxpayers. Those loans and resources provided additional opportunities for 4 million people living in rural America and helped to improve 4,600 miles of lines. We work with 600 rural electric systems, RECs, publicly owned and investor-owned utilities. As part of that $7.1 billion, we committed $152 million in loans for smart meters. This was in addition to the over $300 million that was invested during the Recovery Act in smart grid improvements. We want to build on the opportunity that they present. As has been mentioned earlier, this is about consumers saving money. It's about responding to shortages and outages more quickly and improving the recovery time. For that reason, we're announcing today our intent through RUS to continue our investments in smart grid technology and to increase that commitment. We're committing a minimum of $250 million this year in commitments towards a smart grid. In addition, an additional $106 million will be made available for additional upgrades. As we saw with these young ladies from California, the future is bright for this country. There is no question about it. We want to make sure that as it brightens for all Americans, regardless of where they may live, work, or raise their families. One of the individuals who is probably more responsible than just about anyone in this administration for focusing our attention on the future is Secretary Chu. There are many ways to introduce Secretary Chu to you. Most everyone knows who he is as the Secretary of Energy. Most know about his accomplishments professionally. But I'd just simply like to introduce him as someone I've gotten to know in the last couple of years. One, he is an extraordinary problem solver. And two, he has a very clear vision for the future of this country, a vision that is compelling, inspiring, and exciting. So with that, I give you Steve Chu. Thanks, Steve. Good luck. I apologize for leaving.
Thank you, Tom, for a very generous introduction. I too want to speak with admiration about what you just heard from the two high school soon-to-be seniors. I have to say that in the Department of Energy, we sub-metered our building into 4 sections. We'd like to sub-meter every part of our building. We too discovered that the energy use over the weekend is anomalously high. The only difference is they did it for about a quarter of the cost. So I will be talking to you later about where you buy your stuff. I'm here to talk about the grid, but I want to emphasize that the grid is just not the smart meters. And it's just not the electrical transmission and distribution system. It is really the integration of transmission and distribution with power generation. John Holdren mentioned Tesla, and it was Tesla and Westinghouse who finally won the AC-DC war against Edison. Edison wanted DC, Tesla and Westinghouse wanted AC, and they won, but Edison actually was the first to introduce electricity generation and distribution in a New York City power generating station. Edison, of course, invented many, many other things, the light bulb and the phonograph, among others. Now, let's assume that you can transport through a time machine both Tesla and Edison and Westinghouse from the late 1800s till today, to today. And Edison would be amazed at the progress in lighting and sound recording. He wouldn't understand how an LED works. He wouldn't understand how MP3 compression works or how an iPod works. But on the other hand, he would feel really at home with most of today's power generating system. And that's in the last half of the 19th century, and here we are at the beginning of the 21st century. And we do need a modernized electrical grid for this 21st century economy. So let me give you a couple examples of how other countries are moving out. Ireland and Spain have integrated their renewable energy with fossil. Ireland, for example, is 20% wind. What that means is, time average, 20% of its energy comes from wind. It has a very small interconnection with the British Isles, so it's essentially an island. And when you're 20% wind, that means you're up to 40% peak wind. And yet, in their system of integration, they claim they are not losing much of the value of the investments made on their conventional power supply systems. They have an automatic system that immediately ramps up gas generation to compensate for wind when wind dies down. So there's no power demand side management in Ireland. They think they can go to 40% wind, which means 70% peak wind, without demand side management. Spain is about 25% similarly. They feel that they are not losing much of their return on investment in the actual fossil fuel, but they have an automated system. China has the highest voltage transmission distribution system around the world. Their DC lines of 800,000 kilovolts. With that, they can transmit renewable energy from the western part of China to the eastern part. 1,200 miles, lose less than 7% of the energy. I looked up what the specifications of the US lines, the 765 kilovolt lines we use today are. If we had to transmit that amount of energy over that distance, this is the distance, that's also multi-gigawatts. I think it's 6, 7 gigawatts for this line. If we had to transmit electricity over 1,200 miles, we would lose 80% of the energy. So that just gives you a sample of where we are. And so what do we need to do? We need to modernize the grid. We first, of course, we need to improve the reliability, especially as we face the new complexities, for example, increased two-way flows and the cybersecurity. We need to increase the overall efficiency of our generation, transmission, distribution system. It loses about 6–8% of the energy, even though we're not transmitting over long distances. The grid has to facilitate the growth of renewable energies and enable electric vehicles and dispersed generation. And we need to develop methods to synchronize the electrical systems so that in addition to the market bidding that's an hour or 30 minutes, actually automatic responses that go down to a few minutes and phase control. So, and the modern grid needs to support both distributed and central generation. The transmission, distribution, control systems have to keep pace with renewable energy. And, you know, in the President's call for generating 80% of electricity from clean energy sources by 2035, and putting 1 million vehicles on the road by 2015, and we actually appear to be on schedule. As you may know, GM's Volt has had huge consumer response. They have gone up in production for next year by 50%, and they're planning to go up even faster, I believe. But they see the response. So we need all of these things. We see them coming, and yet we also need to take a hard, sober look at the transmission, distribution planning for states, regions, and national entities. And you need to understand the options and trade-offs. For example, there's a big debate between wind from the Midwest and does it get transported. This is the northern states like North Dakota, South Dakota, other states of that. Do you transmit that energy to Chicago, to St. Louis, to the East Coast, or do you develop sources local to your state? You know, this is a very deep question, and people need to understand. Most states will say, well, we want jobs in our state, we want the generation in our state. But sometimes, if you take that stand, it actually drives up the cost of electricity. And I think going forward, and we fully understand that it creates jobs in the local state, but I think you have to make that trade-off with the fact that if you're allowed to transmit energy across regions, the overall cost can be less. And I think you should have an eyes wide open approach to deciding what's the cost and what's the benefit. And above all the things we do to modernize the grid should be affordable. They should promote overall efficiency and, to use the sophisticated words of our high schoolers, a better ROI, something I learned when I was about 50. But in any case, these are incredible challenges, but they're incredible opportunities. What's the opportunity? Well, if utility companies, merchant generators, market operators, regulators get together and realize what are the technologies and open up a little bit, you want to open it up so that you don't leave investments stranded and you don't get a return on those initial investments. But if you do that, you can get a much better return on your investments in the transmission, in the distribution, in the generation of energy. And this is what it's all about. There is money being left on the table, and so my line to you is, I'm from the federal government. I'm here to help you make money. In any case, President Obama is committed to creating the 21st century electric grid, and in the Recovery Act, we've invested $4.5 billion to upgrade the grid. As you may know, we have installed today more than 5 million smart meters and 140,000 programmable communication thermostats nationwide. Through the Recovery Act, we've deployed a number of smart grid technologies, supporting research and demonstration projects and workforce development, and so it goes. As one example, we're also trying to improve the reliability, efficiency, and customer service. For example, the Western Electric Coordinating Council and its partners are installing single-phaser technology across the Western interconnection. Real-time information and automated controls from the single-phaser technology would permit grid operators to eventually raise the power flow operating limits of the California-Oregon intertie and allow an additional 100 megawatts of operational capability, a small example of a better return on investment. But I go back to the fact that we need to look to ourselves and promote innovative business models that reward efficiency and improve performance. And for that, we need to better understand the consumer behavior. We need to actually have honest discussions and dialogue and cooperation. I stress that partnerships between the power generators, the RTOs, the regulators, the market operators, there is really something to be done. I've been told over and over again that this is very contentious. Certainly, if the federal government tries to force you to do something, your backs bristle. I understand that. So here's the good news. We have no authority. It's kind of like I had no authority over what was happening in deep waters in the Gulf of Mexico, but we can facilitate solutions in the Department of Energy, and we are very serious about trying to facilitate these discussions and brainstorming sessions so that cooperation among these various stakeholders will really increase the return on investments in our electrical system. And so, in addition to that, we see incredible opportunities for technology development. For FY Budget 12 requests, we've asked for an energy innovation hub on smart grid technologies and systems. In ARPA-E, for example, we see wide spaces in wide bandgap semiconductor materials. We still shift voltages up and down at 60 hertz. You know, same as we did 120 years ago. We can actually do much better than that. And we can develop those technologies. And I can go on and on. But I just want to say that We're investing in the research. We also want to help facilitate discussions so all of you can get a better return on your investments. And we look forward to working with you all here today to build a smarter, stronger, and more secure grid, and help us seize the opportunity to once again make the American electrical distribution, transmission, generation system the leader in the world. This is our opportunity, and in fact, we have to do this because if we don't, we will be disadvantaged relative to all the other economies of the world. So with that, I thank you, and I guess can take questions. So.
Thanks. Tom Tiernan with Platts Newsletters. Question addressing cybersecurity. There's, as everybody's mentioned, it's a work in progress that's been in place for years. There's been private investment, there's stimulus funding going in place, yet the cybersecurity element of a policy framework is just now coming out. And I know NIST is working on standards and whatnot, but that's a years-long progress, or at least a long-term effort. Can you address the concern about cybersecurity being addressed midstream, so to speak?
Well, I think it is, this is one part which is justifiably has a lot of concern. I think there's no secret that if our grid system, and as you go to even more automated controls, that if this is not really made in a designed and put in a secure place, there could be really some serious consequences of this, and we know of examples of other countries mucking with another country's grid because of some dispute regarding a bill, for example. and so this is something very serious. We in the Department of Energy do think this is very serious, and we are trying to cooperate with all the other agencies in doing this. I mean, we do have some experience in the Department of Energy on keeping secure networks. This is a very different situation because in many instances you keep a secure network by actually physically putting in physical firewalls. This is something very different because by its very nature has to be interconnected. But it is a very big deal. We are doing what we can do. There's continuing, but this is not something that's put on the back burner. This is very much on the front burner, and that's all I can say at the moment. And we are looking at everything we can do and discussing with all the other agencies. Okay.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. Tom Catania with Whirlpool Corporation. I want to make sure I understand the example you gave of Ireland and their use of, I assume, natural gas peakers or something to sort of instantaneously respond. Would you still advocate that maybe a more elegant solution is demand response through smarter products, for example, on the grid, as opposed to bringing on peaker plants?
I actually think it's going to be a mixture of both. Certainly demand response is something which makes a lot of sense. It distributes the loads so that when your refrigerator, for example, when it goes into the defrost cycle, you don't want it to go into the defrost cycle, as you well know, at 3 p.m. in the afternoon on a hot summer day where it's blowing in hot air and that's to cool it down. You might as well do it at 3 a.m. where energy is very cheap. So those automatic demand response things are a natural and a no-brainer. But in addition to that, there are, right now we keep spinning hot reserves going. There are technologies being developed today. For example, General Electric just announced, as one example, a combined cycle generator. This is over 55% electrical generation. That has an incredibly fast ramp-up speed. I mean, megawatts per minute ramp up, okay? So that from cold, not from hot. So there are technologies being developed today. It's going to require all of these things. So while we want the air conditioning systems, here's another example. Since energy is much cheaper at night, you can actually think of storing a thermal inertial system at night that you can then use to cool your building during the peak of the day. Okay? These are all demand shifts that make it better to have a better return on investment of all our power generation and distribution systems, all of these things. So I think that it's not either or. You want to do all of these things. Okay? And it, I see the day. It's debatable whether it's going to be 10 years or 15 years from today, maybe as long as 20, but that's the time scale where solar, for example, will cost, in terms of levelized cost of electricity, somewhere around 6, maybe 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So let's, there's a 50-50 chance it will occur within this decade. So imagine what happens when it is 6 or 7 cents a kilowatt hour. It goes on a lot of rooftops, especially in warehouses. And so, again, you're going to need a grid that can handle that. That will do a lot of peak shaving. So there are many, many things. But our grid right now cannot handle the fact that when renewable energy gets to be the same price as fossil energy without subsidy, which will happen, we need to concurrently develop this grid. And it's going to happen over the next 20 years. Otherwise, we will be staying at 20, 30, at maximum 40, but say 20 or 30% renewables because it's intermittent. I also didn't mention the fact that when you can lower the cost of energy storage at the megawatt and megawatt hour, or tens of megawatt hour, that will have a profound effect on how we use our electrical system. Just to stabilize the voltage, those very short-term things you can save a couple % right off the bat of energy loss. What we do now, as you well know, is we overfill, and we just throw the energy away because it's overfilled, and it just sloshes away if someone doesn't use it. So with a factor of 2 or 3 decrease in what I call this 10 megawatt, 1 megawatt energy storage, you can have a profound impact on the cost structures as well. There's many, many things that will happen within this decade. And yet we don't seem to be anticipating these technological changes and start to build it into the planning process. And I see significantly more, quite frankly, in Europe and in Asia. So I'm just saying, hey, there's opportunities. These technologies, these prices and these technologies, the ones closest to this know very well how rapidly they're coming down, like energy storage, for example. So huge opportunities.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, Lily Coney, the Electronic Privacy Information Center. Our interest is on the individual customer energy usage data. I'd like to hear what more is being done to make sure that the privacy principles called fair information practices are built into the thinking process for developing the grid so that consumers' data is protected.
I think this is something that is being built in automatically. The last thing you want to do is to have anybody be able to broadcast your use of energy because, for example, it tells you when you're on vacation. And so there's a security issue there. And so I think all the utility companies are very aware that you need to really make sure that the privacy, that someone can't hack in and start to read, the daily use of someone's energy. It's a very important part of the cybersecurity, for example. So I think we're all aware of this and want to make sure that no one can hack in. Okay? Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. And the fair information part section, they're in there, the tips.
All right, I'd like to call up with me here my fellow panelists.
here, David Hayes is the Deputy Secretary at the Department of the Interior, which has a very important role in the siting of transmission facilities, something we'll talk about. Sitting next to him, Bob Shepard from Encore, which is a utility located in Texas, and we'll talk about a very exciting initiative they're going to be rolling out. Cheryl LaFleur is a commissioner on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission here in Washington, D.C. And finally, we have from North Dakota the president of NARUC, Tony Clark, who is also joining us. And this panel represents the challenge and opportunity of energy policy in the 21st century. It does cut across different disciplines, different agencies, and different parts of the overall ecosystem. A couple points that the Secretary of Energy just made are worth underscoring. There are a number of interacting parts of the overall grid. I will mention three, all of which get lumped under smart grid, and it's also worth noting what he mentioned, that other parts of the ecosystem, think about storage, he had an example there, transmission lines, are also part of the overall fabric of our energy system, and that's what makes this such an exciting and challenging set of opportunities. With respect to the three that we'll focus on today that are the heart of the report, one is the local transmission distribution part of the electricity network, the wires, if you will. There is energy loss in those wires. There is vulnerability to them. That's an area where the smart grid opportunity is taking shape, helping us manage our energy better by real-time visibility into the grid. The meters, and it's not just about smart meters, even in what I'm calling smart grid here, provide the interface between the network and the user, be it a business or a consumer. There's the most modern kind of meters that we talked about in the report, AMI meters. There's an earlier generation, AMR, and even the original meters that some are still actually out there. All those are being used, and there's a huge opportunity that was mentioned about how energy usage information, and the high school students said it better than I could, can really change behavior in a very impactful way. So we appreciate you all bringing that home to us. And then finally, and the gentleman from Whirlpool asked this very question, there are all sorts of applications, appliances, and now even electric vehicles that plug into the grid, and those can be smarter and can help manage energy more efficiently. So let me start off with a broad question about this opportunity about grid modernization and what it means and why it's important. And I'll start with David right here next to me. As you look at this challenge, how do you get your arms around it?
Thank you very much, Phil. From the Department of the Interior's perspective, the grid modernization issue is important for a couple of reasons. One is that we are playing an increasingly significant role in generation, in facilitating the siting of new renewable projects, as well as our traditional role in facilitating conventional energy development. Just to give you a little flavor for how significant our attention in this area is, in the last quarter of last year, we permitted more than 4,000 megawatts of new renewable energy on our public lands. The Department of Interior, as you probably know, manages 25% of the land mass of the United States, and in addition has the offshore permitting responsibility. Those 4,000 megawatts were mostly in the Southwest, mostly solar, some geothermal, some wind. But this administration and this president has pushed us very hard to move in this direction. Prior to the president's election, there were no commercial solar facilities in the United States on public lands. This Friday, Secretary Salazar will be in Blythe, California, with a groundbreaking of the largest solar facility in the world. So we are interested in the grid because in order to bring this generation to market, we need transmission, we need the ability to deal with some of the variability of renewable energy, particularly wind in that respect. So we're quite interested in that. The other aspect I will say, and I'm sure we'll get into more of this as we do more discussion, as a primary land manager in the United States, in addition to dealing with the opportunities for generation, we are we have a special role to play, particularly in the West, in terms of hopefully facilitating the siting of transmission lines. That's not only the West, but also the Great Plains and the Midwest. As you know, there are tremendous stranded generation opportunities, stranded because of the lack of transmission. We have been putting on a fast-track basis, working with the Department of Energy and our other federal partners, the identification of transmission lines that need to be sited on our public lands and working up strategies to facilitate the permitting of those lines. Last year, we permitted 500 miles of new transmission. This year, we have a fast-track goal of another 500 or 600 miles. We have 5,000 miles of identified corridors that affect our lands that we are working in a multidisciplinary way to help site. So those are some of the areas that, finally, I will mention, we also see as one of the enormous potential resources for our grid the offshore Atlantic. And we have a new system called Smart from the Start to develop those enormous resources, which of course are tremendously attractive because they are so close to the major load centers in the Northeast. And as you know, and apologies to those who live on Cape Cod, we did permit the Cape Wind project, which will be the largest, one of the largest offshore projects in the world, offshore wind projects in the world. So that's our angle, Phil.
Well, you've teed up after the Secretary did as well, Tony from North Dakota, where obviously there's a great deal of interest in your wind. How, coming from a wind-rich state, does the grid modernization project look to you?
Well, thanks, Phil. And North Dakota does seem to come up an awful lot when they talk about windy states, so I guess I resemble that particular remark. The potential for grid modernization does have a great impact on states like North Dakota, South Dakota, geographically remote states, but states that have a very wind-rich environment, but it's an intermittent resource. And so you need to be able to modernize the grid to fully tap the potential of renewable resources. An example that I like to give is in North Dakota, we're one of those still a little bit strange states where we're a winter peaking state because of our cold winters. We have a higher peak in the winter. It's also, if you look at the wind profile, wind tends to blow a lot in the winter and in the middle of the night. So the type of devices that we're looking at, for example, are electrothermal storage devices where you literally heat up bricks in the middle of the night, and as long as that furnace basically can interact with the market in a real-time basis, then it can help load shape so that it's drawing power off the network at times when we'd like it economically to draw off the network, store that energy, and then be able to use it in your home during parts of the day when you need to. Similar things can be done with water heaters that act as thermal storage devices. And if you can interact with the grid, it's not the only answer. There are lots of issues with renewables, and there's lots of things that we need to deal with intermittency. But it's one of those tool sets in certain circumstances that can have a tremendously beneficial impact, not only for consumers, but for the grid itself.
Well, electric vehicles would function the same way. You'd want those being charged at night as well. Bob, you've seen this, in some sense, Texas is at the front lines of this grid modernization project. Maybe you want to give people a little bit of insight into some of what's happening there, and particularly with your utility.
Sure, I'd love to. Is this working? Just to set this up a bit, though, one statement I'd like to make. We're going to invest $500 billion in the next decade in the grid in this country, $500 billion. So it's not like we're not going to invest a lot of money in the grid. What we're trying to make sure, I think, is that we don't look back in 10 years and see that all we've done is replicate the capability we've got today. There's a big investment ahead of us. We're simply trying to modernize that and take advantage of these technologies that exist today. The T&D business has been kind of sleepy for 3 or 4 decades. Most of the technology and innovation in this industry has been in generation. We made great strides in generation. We've dramatically improved coal plants. We've cut heat rates in half at gas plants. A lot of investment made, a lot of technology gains. And we're set up today to make those gains on the grid because of some of the microprocessing capabilities and some of the communications capabilities that exist today that enable us to do all these things. So we're real excited about it. We think there's tremendous economic and environmental benefits to doing it. But what we need to do, now it's on, is engage consumers. We get a lot of pushback today. There's a lot of questioning of advances to the grid, specifically the meters, questioning by consumers and therefore by regulators. So we've got to first tell the compelling value proposition, why this is a good idea, why the investments are compelling, and then engage with consumers and get the momentum behind that. So we're announcing a program in Texas and in California, actually, called the Biggest Energy Saver. And both Encore in Texas and CenterPoint in Texas and San Diego Gas and Electric and some components of it are announcing a program today called the Biggest Energy Saver. And it's a program to really engage consumers and really see what the benefits are of giving them all this additional information and the tools to use that. And it's a three-part program that starts with a blog program where consumers can talk to experts about how to use energy wiser, how to use less electricity. They also have an app contest where we're going to encourage app developers to develop apps for these devices on your belt and iPhones and those type of things, where you can manage your energy consumption in your home from those. And then an energy savings contest. Over the months of August and September, we're going to measure who can reduce their consumption the most in percentages. Percentages, not absolute dollars, so it's not biased towards large consumers. And we're going to give prizes up to and including plug-in electric vehicles, a suite of GE electrical appliances. Tyndall is going to offer in-home devices to consumers. We're going to really get the reaction of consumers, and we're going to see what consumers can actually do if they have the data we're planning to give them to reduce their consumption. You're going to see that result. You extrapolate that across the country, and the results will be enormous, what we can get from that. So we're really excited about it. Again, it's CenterPoint, Encore, and San Diego Gas and Electric. We have the strong support of Landis & Gyr and Itron, the two meter manufacturers. IBM and GE are very strong supporters of it as well. So I think we're really excited about the results of that. And I think then we'll be able to look back and say...
Do you have a website yet you can announce? Not yet, huh?
There isn't. I don't know it.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. It's coming. But there will no longer be a question of can consumers use power smarter. We're going to enable... One last thing, I'll give it away. All we've ever done with consumers is send them an electric bill once a month, and it's high. And they don't know anything about it. It's just high. We don't give any details. It's like going to the grocery store, packing your cart with groceries, and once a month the grocer sends you a big bill. It doesn't break out steaks from eggs from milk. You don't know how to cut that bill. We're trying to give consumers the data to allow them to use energy smarter. I hate the response from some people who say they won't use the data, why are we bothering, why are we spending the money? That thinking we wouldn't have this thing on our belts today. So I think it's just the start, and we're real excited about it.
So you've nicely segued to the next question, which is changing the relationship about how we think about the grid. That affects policymakers and regulators who are looking at regulatory reforms. It affects consumers in ways you've already adverted to. We'll talk a little more about that. And it affects businesses because there's some different business models. It's worth saying here that historically, electric utilities were not thinking, first and foremost, how do we enable consumers to save electricity? The contest you've mentioned is a leadership effort. We applaud it to do just that. From a regulatory perspective, Tony, I wonder, how do you look at this question about what are the incentives, what are the regulatory models in terms of the message that we're sending overall to businesses and consumers alike?
Sure. Well, the issue of smart grid has engaged state commissioners in a big way, and a lot of it is because we understand that a lot of the decisions that are going to be made at the state level. If you look at a recent report by the Electric Power Research Institute, they indicate about 70% of the costs are on the distribution side or the state side of where the costs are going to be coming down. So we're very keyed into it. At the same time, we understand that in some ways smart grid challenges some of the old regulatory models that we've had. One of the issues that can come up and is sometimes difficult in a traditional rate-regulated world is when you have something like smart grid where the costs are fairly precise. We have a general sense for what the costs might be to roll some of these out, but the benefits are more diffuse, especially in a world where we don't know exactly all of the things that are going to happen because of this technology. In that sense, it is a little bit like the wireless world where you wouldn't have been able to predict today all of the applications that ride on that wireless network. That can be a challenging thing to try to incorporate as part of a regulatory process. In the wireless world, it was somewhat easier because we could just cleave off wireless and say that's not a part of the regulated world really anymore, but we'll keep plain old telephone service over here and continue to regulate that. Much more difficult to do in the electricity space where it's really a part of that regulated system. It's harder to break it out. But nonetheless, I think we do have tools to analyze some of this data. The important thing is ensuring that the information gets in those actual records in front of each of the states, so states have a good baseline on which to base their decision. And there are probably opportunities to explore alternative forms of regulation in this space that may be able to facilitate some of it. I've heard some folks talk about the potential for price cap regulation and how that might work with the smart grid. I've had other folks here talk about performance-based regulation, where you might allow a utility, especially where there are operational reliability benefits to the grid, you may allow them cost recovery with some sort of performance-based principles that would allow rate recovery. So I'm convinced that we have the tools to do it. It's just a matter of how do we adopt those tools to this new reality that we have in smart grid.
Cheryl, one of the signposts on the road, if you will, is looking at some of the bulk industrial users and others who can buy directly in the wholesale market. And one thing that FERC has tried to do is help look at that market with an eye towards what's the opportunity for demand response. In fact, I think your chair, Wellinghoff, said that demand response is the killer application of smart grid. That, of course, remains to be seen, but nonetheless, the experience in the wholesale market suggests there is some opportunity to have people selling back to the grid on a more dynamic basis. Maybe you want to tell a little bit about that story.
Yeah, at FERC, thank you. At FERC, we regulate the wholesale and interstate electricity and gas markets and the wholesale and electric infrastructure like transmission. And so our job is to help ensure that the wholesale markets are set up fairly for both supply-side resources, like the new renewable generation that Secretary Chu talked about, and demand-side resources, like aggregated demand response. FERC has been working on making sure that demand response is paid fairly in the wholesale market so that when it's beneficial to customers to rely on that rather than on firing up a generator, the market will work to make that happen. And we, I think, really have to work closely with the states like Tony's and others who are working on demand response in the retail market and the customer-specific applications. We're more worried about the ones that are large aggregated groups of customers who might bid in together almost like a power plant, particularly as we see more intermittent resources where you need something to fill in when the wind or solar is not available. Demand response has a huge potential there. So I think we're just really beginning to unlock the power of how much we'll see on the wholesale level.
Another point I want to get to, Bob, for you is this point about consumers. You're obviously very passionate about getting consumers access to their energy usage data. I share that passion. I've also, over the years, and Tony knows this, talked to state regulators about them being in the innovation policy business. I usually did that from the standpoint of telecommunications, where there was a lot of dynamism going on in the 90s with the Telecom Act 1996. Now I can do so also with an energy side perspective, because smart grid is basically innovation policy, and the issues around access to data get into privacy, thinking about the cost recovery of this, whatever technology is necessary, and thinking about security. How do you talk to your regulators, and how have the Texas regulators taken that challenge on board?
Well, firstly, in Texas, by law, the data belongs to the consumer. So that data can only be provided to a third party with their consent. Now, we have a lot of parties, Google and others, who want to help consumers manage their electric bills, and we love the fact that they're all going to throw their products at the consumer. But first and foremost, the consumer owns the data. And therefore, that's the first point. And we actually believe that's the right model. Donna's nodding, so she made the rule. So we believe the consumer should own the data, and that kind of addresses that issue right up front, where that belongs. And in terms of security, I know the question was asked of the Energy Secretary. We designed these systems with firewalls. It's going to be very difficult for someone to go through a house and take down a transmission system. There are other ways to take down a transmission system. They'll
Don't tell them here, by the way.
I'd blow up a few substations before I tried to get through your smart meter into the transmission grid. That's a long path to go to get there. So we really think we firewall and protect that very well. But consumer data belongs to the consumer, first and foremost, and then they'll provide that to third parties. I think it's really exciting that there's so many third parties that want to come in and help them with their energy consumption and help them manage it. And I think we're just starting to see the innovation that will come. When we went from an analog to a digital phone switch, the brass ring was three-way calling. And I think we've got a ways to go here. Let's just give the consumer the information, let the market work, let people like Tyndall help them, let others help them, I don't think we know where it's going. And then there's the enabling capability. It's going to enable distributed generation. It's going to help electric vehicles penetrate much quicker because you got the ability to recharge at night. I just think it's the beginning.
So you've set me up nicely for something else that Secretary Chu talked about. Even without the formal authority that the states have with respect to overseeing this point, the federal government has the power of convening. In the case of George Arnold, where are you, George? Are you here? Impatient convening. And that's an important role to be played. The standards being developed under the auspices of EISA, the Energy Independent Security Act, are part of what's going to facilitate interoperability in this realm. That's an area that's just starting to unfold. It's an area where ultimately FERC has some oversight, and there's a FERC policy team that talks about it. Cheryl, I don't know if you want to give people a little background as to how the role of the federal government as convener and facilitator in this standard setting, and then I want to talk a little more about the states and the industry on best practice as well.
Yeah, thanks. Under the 2007 law, FERC has the authority to work with NIST, George Arnold and others, and oversee the process by which standards for the smart grid, including the security of the smart grid, are being developed, and determine when there's been a sufficient consensus that the standards can be adopted. And we're really a piece of the process to work with all the people who are working on the standards, because it's a voluntary standard setting process, a consensus-built process, to give them, increase their utilization through adoption at the FERC level. We've had 2 technical conferences in the last several months and are working closely on the next step of the first suite of standards that have come forward. And then I think adoption is one more step on the path to ensure that the standards are there to benefit. We're also very involved in security through our reliability, direct reliability authority, and the critical infrastructure standards that are mandatory for the transmission grid that are another big part of security.
Tone, don't I ask you the same question? From the state side, standard setting is not an area where the states have a lot of experience, and yet these standards are going to impact on them. How do you take a look at that?
Right. State commissioners are very interested in it because, as we all know, the technical standards eventually become a commercial standard, which eventually directly interface with the retail sort of regulation that states do. But as you mentioned, Phil, I mean, standard setting itself is not a core competency of state government. And states, as regulators, we're really trying to focus on the idea of core competencies, which level of government does what best. So there's obviously going to be a very large federal role in standard setting and in cybersecurity. The one issue that I think states are very concerned about, in addition to just simply the reliability of the grid and ensuring its security, is that we want to make sure that as part of the processes that we have, those rate cases that we have as much information as we can have to make sound decisions as we pass those rate cases through. The one thing that frustrates state commissioners, and we want to be sure that we don't get into, are these sort of blank check operations where the utility comes to us and says, well, this is all very important, you just have to trust us, here's the check, and pass it along to consumers. We want to make sure that we're fully engaged in the process, and so we understand exactly what's being asked of state commissions to pass through to their consumers.
And I should say, when the first principle we talked about of cost-effective investments in market technology, that's what it's getting at, a shared understanding about scaling what works, understanding what the ROI is for a particular investment, and that's something that takes, again, ongoing work, and there's a lot going on at DOE. I know Pat Hoffman is here from the Office of Electricity. She's done an unbelievable job with her team to help work with the states on that very point. Let me go into the federal level on another dimension, which is we talked about this transmission infrastructure that ties it all together and the necessary cooperation there. I want to start with David on this point. That's not a small challenge across different regions, across the federal government. How are you going about pursuing that?
It has been a big challenge, Phil, in terms of how to deal with the planning side of transmission from the federal point of view. And there is an awkwardness here about the relative authorities involved. Shortly after we took office, Secretary Salazar, Chairwoman Chu, or rather Secretary Chu, Chairwoman Sutley, Tom Vilsack and John Wellinghoff started having meetings that we participated in on a monthly basis to basically figure out how can we, as part of the federal family, help rationalize where the investments need to be made from a planning perspective in terms of new transmission lines. We all stand ready wanting to facilitate the investment at the right place, in the right way, at the right scale, and avoid what we were hearing from many governors that that we have a chaotic situation out there. Governor Friedenthal of Wyoming was the most famous. He's probably visited most of you on this subject, even now in private life, where he complains about the spaghetti that Wyoming's going to look like because companies A, B, C, and D all have their own transmission projects. Often these are smaller projects, right? And here, as we are stewards of our public lands, we'd prefer to have one large project running through the public lands rather than several smaller ones. Well, what has evolved out of that are a couple of things. One is the Recovery Act. The DOE invested significant funds in a planning effort that many of you in this room are engaged in. And we've been following up, our sort of kitchen cabinet, if you will, of cabinet officials have been following up with some of you on this. You've identified foundational lines, both in the west and the east, where we should give priority attention. That's a big step forward. We want to continue to work with you on that. We're very interested, and I know that Cheryl and John and their colleagues at FERC are working at how to figure out the cost allocation issues associated with bringing together, consolidating some of these lines and having fewer larger lines. But frankly, it's an ongoing work in progress, and I think there are some opportunities for more creativity between government and industry here as we try to figure this out. What you have in this administration is a cabinet that is eager to deliver results in terms of having more and better transmission, and obviously the overlay of a smarter grid is part of that. But we need that foundation as well if we're going to move into the next generation of a smart grid.
Very well said. Cheryl, you want to supplement that from the FERC perspective?
Yes, we definitely we need to modernize the grid. We need more high voltage interstate transmission for reliability, to replace aging infrastructure, to make markets work better, reduce costs to consumers and businesses, to enable all smart grid things we've talked about already this morning, and finally to connect new clean energy resources. There's clean energy requirements already in 31 states, talking about them on the federal level, and many of our best opportunities are remotely located from load. These are investments that are going to be around for a long time. Maybe not, the ones still from Tesla and Edison may not be up, but these investments last 50 or 60 years. So we need to be sure we put them in the right places, we plan them carefully, we use the best technology that's available, and we make them as efficient as we can. And FERC is working really on complementing the DOE planning efforts. We're working on a proposed rule that would strengthen and broaden the requirements that are already in place for regional transmission planning. This is mandatory transmission planning. Also require potentially, the proposal was to require regions to plan with the neighboring regions over to facilitate projects across regions that are considered by both regions to be in their best interests. And finally, to ensure that planning doesn't just take into account reliability, which is what utilities have done forever and done very well, but also new policy requirements that are being put in place at the state and federal level. So I think we're hoping that that rule is just a step on the path, but it'll be an important next step because we need to get this planning done right.
Tony, from the state side, how does this planning of transmission and siting look to you, and why is this continually such a persistent challenge?
Well, it's a challenge because you have lots of different state interests that are out there, and we've seen some of that even through our own regional planning efforts. But I think the goal is really to, and it was something that Secretary Chu said that I think really hit home for me personally, which is this idea is that through regional planning we can have a better sense for what the true costs and benefits of different options are. Obviously, I have a bias coming from North Dakota that I think it's a pretty good idea to build Great Plains wind and then bring it to load. There are other folks who, within their own states, have said, "Nah, we'd rather have that generation built closer to load." I think Secretary Chu's words were, we should go into this with our eyes wide open. And I think that's what this planning process will help do, and that's why states have been so involved with it. Look, if Great Plains wind is more expensive a proposition for those end-use customers in other parts of the country, then you shouldn't build it. On the other hand, if the other parts of the country that might want generation closer to load go into it knowing that they may in fact be raising their rates to a degree much higher than they need to be raised, then I think they have a very real policy choice to make about what that means for their existing manufacturing base, what that means for their businesses in those communities, and at least all of us are making those decisions from a point of having information as to a point of ignorance.
So, Bob, I want to end the panel discussion and have a little time for a few questions on this broad point about cooperation across different disciplines as we set out with our eyes open, call it a investment agenda with prioritizations, thoughtful understanding of what is cost effective, how to make it work, engaging consumers, the utilities, et cetera. As you look at that challenge, what are some of your top of mind principles and reactions in terms of making this next decade of effort successful? So we look back and, as you said, say, we didn't just stay on autopilot. We really took a look at what our direction was and move the needle.
I don't think we can solve this state by state. I think we have to build momentum nationally. I'm chairman of GridWise Alliance, and we created a 501c3 called Grid 21, which is going to oversee our customer engagement program, but it's also designed to oversee future customer engagement programs around the country. I think we have to do this and spread this. If we get more and more results of consumers, that will drive opinion. We need to develop a compelling value proposition. And there is a compelling value proposition here. Investment in the grid will save this country tens of billions of dollars a year and have great environmental benefits. We've got to develop that policy so regulators around the country will get, frankly, air cover from it and be compelled by it. And consumers will be compelled by it. I think we need to give them a compelling value proposition, support consumer engagement, and let the momentum build. To go sell this one state by state is enormously painful. And if we can build that support for it, I think you'll have consumers and regulators saying, we need to do that.
David, you're nodding your head. Do you want to jump on that?
Well, I think these statements are so true to be self-evident. I sound like I'm starting the Declaration of Independence here. But you know, we are talking about enormous change in this country, about the opportunity for a clean energy economy, about much more information to consumers about how they use their energy, you know, resulting in much more efficient use of energy. These are enormous changes, and we do need to find a way to build off the strength of our state system and the commitment of our federal government together, along with the business community, to find a new paradigm here. Because it's frustrating to everyone in this room, I think, the status quo, where the institutional structures are not well designed for dealing with this challenge and this opportunity. And I'm very pleased that we're all here together, because we need to build on this dialogue. As I mentioned before, this administration has such a forward lean into these issues. We want to improve the status quo, provide the opportunities for investment, modernize our grid situation, help all citizens and all businesses along the way. So I welcome these ideas, and let's keep this dialogue going. Just in a scheduling meeting this morning, we have another meeting on Friday with Chairman Wellinghoff, with Secretary Salazar, with Secretary Chu, with Secretary Vilsack, with Chair Sutley on this subject, and we are ready to continue to put our shoulder to the wheel, and we'll look forward to the follow-up from this discussion.
I just have one last on that.
Please.
And one of the nice things is this doesn't take government money. If we can get clarity, the utility industry can deploy all the capital. With clarity, we can raise all the capital we need. So this is something the government can encourage through rules and clarity, but it doesn't take federal money, which is great in this tight budget times.
Tony?
Well, I think one of the things that we need to make sure to do is leverage the strength of each level of government. So I've been very pleased. We've been working closely with DOE, and I think we're just in the infancy of a partnership to work on issues related to consumer privacy and data. The key is that sort of information can then be put into the records at state commissions so that you begin to build a sort of a standard of best practices. At the same time, I do really feel that we need to continue to have that flexibility at the state level to implement these in ways that work in those specific regions. We're going to make very different decisions probably in places like the Upper Great Plains where we have 6 and 7 cent retail rates and a particular load profile and generation profile than they might in Texas or Southern California or New York. And that's okay to have some of those differences, but to the degree that we can democratize information about best practices with regard to consumer privacy issues, how technology can be integrated so you can utilize that in ways that make sense for your region. I think the federal government can be a tremendous partner for states as we're really on the front lines of trying to implement some of these very powerful technologies.
Cheryl?
Well, I just want to echo what my colleagues have said. I think that the solutions for the future are going to come from really the federal government and the states and local actors working together in a consensus building process. The grid is going to be modernized. We are going to spend a lot of money on it. The question is, are we going to spend it in the right places? We're going to spend it efficiently. We're going to do what we really need. And the best way to get that is to work together, look at these issues broadly, and then act. And that's the step we have to take.
So in terms of what we'll do next, we're going to break up into breakout groups and continue 3 of the high-level themes that have been outlined. The first is this changing paradigm of how the regulatory system works, how businesses operate, and how consumers act within that. You all should have on your sort of sheets which one you're going to. The second gets to this point about innovation, access to data, interoperability, and how technological changes in this area will be able to be impacted. And finally, we're going to hear more about this regional planning transmission challenge that obviously there's a lot of good shoulder to the wheel. And what we'll do then is come back to this room and have sort of a report out. We'll hear from our Chief Technology Officer and my brother in arms in this, Anish Chopra, about this very point. This report and this discussion is more like a revival meeting than a victory lap. We are not done. We are in the midst of reviving our energy level to continue to take on what is a high level, from the president on down, commitment to how we can move towards a clean energy economy, and we need the grid in a 21st century fashion to do that. So each room, by the way, will have a state co-lead with someone from the federal government. As Tony said, the folks at NARUC have worked very closely with all those involved in this effort, George Arnold, Pat Hoffman, and others. It's going to continue to work across a number of issues. So if people don't know where they're going, right out here, someone will help direct you. For now, I want to thank our panelists for really helping to get us revved up for this.